Hey, hi everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for joining this event today. We had a few technical problems just starting, so I apologize that we're starting a couple of minutes late. Of course, the app was updated this weekend, which threw a couple of us into a little bit of turmoil. And it's great to see that there's so much interest from everyone around the world in today's conversation. In fact, we have over 400 people from more than 60 countries who have registered for this event. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in. And maybe I'll just mention a few of those countries. Obviously, I'm not going to do all 60, but we have people here. We have panelists here in the United States and also in different parts of Europe. But we have people who have joined this conversation from Costa Rica, from Denmark, Switzerland, Ireland, Argentina, Nigeria, Germany, Kenya, Cambodia, Japan, South Africa, Chile, France, Australia, Croatia, Morocco, Venezuela, Ghana, Ethiopia, Somalia, Cameroon, Indonesia, Peru, Myanmar, New Zealand, Brazil, India, Mali, Burundi, the Netherlands, Burkina Faso, Uganda, Bangladesh, and Norway. So people from all around the world. My name is Simon Adams. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And let me just say, maybe by way of introduction, that 15 years ago, the responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity was unanimously adopted at the 2005 UN World Summit, which was the largest gathering of heads of state and government in history. And I guess a quick summation would be that R2P is a promise to those people for whom atrocities are not just abstract words, but are real acts that pose an existential threat to them, to their loved ones, and their communities. And over the past 15 years, R2P has undoubtedly helped save lives in several different country situations. Within the UN, the Security Council and Human Rights Council have respectively adopted 83 and 46 resolutions that include a reference to R2P. States have also built what we would call communities of commitment around the implementation of R2P, including the largest group of friends at the UN and the global network of R2P focal points. But suffice to say, of course, much work remains to be done. And so this year's celebration of the 15th anniversary of R2P takes place at a time when human rights, when humanitarianism, when multilateral diplomacy all appear to be under threat. And not since the UN was formed in 1945 have so many people been displaced by persecution, by conflict, and by war. And the scale of international failure in Syria, in Myanmar, in Yemen, and elsewhere has been immense and has had devastating consequences for vulnerable populations. So we are very honored today to have with us 4 individuals who contributed immensely to the development of the norm and its implementation over the last 15 years. The UN Secretary General's special advisors for the responsibility to protect have been instrumental in championing R2P within and beyond the UN system. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. This event is being recorded and is being broadcast live also on the YouTube, the Global Center's YouTube channel. Thank you to everybody who sent us questions ahead of today's event. We received a lot of interesting questions for all 4 of the special advisors, and we collated a set that we hope will help get a conversation going. We encourage everyone in the audience to submit additional questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. And when you submit a question, please include your name, your affiliation, and where you're watching and listening from. And throughout the event, please also interact with us on Twitter by tagging @GCR2P and using the hashtag R2P15. So now I'd like to introduce very briefly, they've got very extensive CVs, but very briefly, our 4 special advisors. Of course, we have Dr. Edward Luck. He's currently the Arnold A. Saltzman Professor of Professional Practice in International and Public Affairs at Columbia University in New York. He was the very first special advisor on R2P and held this position between 2008 and 2012. We also have Professor Jennifer Welsh, and she's now the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security and the Director of the Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University in Canada. She was the special advisor on R2P between 2013 and 2016. We have Ambassador Ivan Simonovic, who is, of course, a diplomat, a politician, a legal scholar, and the former Minister of Justice of Croatia. He served as Assistant Secretary General on Human Rights between 2010 and 2016, and was subsequently Special Advisor on R2P until 2018. And he's now the current Ambassador of Croatia to the UN. And finally, last but not least, appointed in 2019, we have Dr. Karen Smith. She's the current Special Advisor and also a lecturer in international relations at the Institute for History at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and an honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So hopefully this webinar will be more of a fireside chat than a seminar. And so I'm going to break with diplomatic protocol a little bit and refer to you all by your first names. Given the amount of time I think we've all spent in the political trenches together, I hope that's appropriate. But let me start maybe with a question for our first special advisor. And I should say as well, I've got questions that have been sent in for each of the individual special advisors, but if there's something that they say that you particularly agree with, disagree with, or would like to clarify, feel free to jump in after they've spoken as well. So maybe to start with you, Ed, you were the first special advisor on R2P. Did you have any specific vision or goals of what the special advisor role should look like? And as a follow-up to that, while serving as special advisor, you were the one who helped articulate the three-pillar approach to R2P as set out in the Secretary General's 2009 report. So more than a decade later, that approach is the dominant lens through which people define and analyze the norms. So did you expect the three-pillar approach to have the kind of traction that it has had in terms of how we define the implementation of R2P? Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you very much to you and your colleagues for organizing this. When you're first, you have certain advantages and certain disadvantages. The big advantage is you have open field. So you make some decisions very early on and try to make the Secretary General and I agreed.
You went a little bit robotic there. It was a little bit 2001: A Space Odyssey, but I think you're okay now, Ed.
Okay, this is the first time I've been associated with Space Odyssey. I was saying that going first has certain advantages and certain disadvantages. You have no precedent out in the field, and so you can try to pick and choose ways to try to define the position and try to make a difference. And I had basically a three-part mandate, and which would have been overwhelming. The first was to develop R2P politically, because while member states had agreed in 2005, by 2008, 2009, a lot of them were having second thoughts about it. So get something together and get the member states as much as possible on board. The second was to give some coherence to a doctrine and a strategy for moving forward, because there are a lot of good things in the outcome document in 2005, but it didn't really come together as a coherent package. And that was very important, both for getting member states aboard and for making it happen operationally. And that brings me to the third piece, which was to develop it institutionally and operationally. And I thought that was very important. In some ways, it was very tough, and obviously, much of that work has been left to my successors. But we had to say that this was not simply a theory and a principle, but it actually would make some difference in practice. So we became very active in making statements, trying to get involved in individual situations. And what I thought was extremely important, particularly at the beginning, was to develop a direct and personal relationship with the Secretary General. If he faced a crisis, it might have implications for atrocities. He turned to me, and my colleague Francis, genocide prevention. So we actually enacted part of the dialogue, because otherwise it would become very much afterthought. Those are the three areas we worked on. And you asked about the three pillars. I feel very good about it. I had the advantage of having known the Secretary General a bit beforehand and worked on his 2006 campaign to become Secretary General. So he tended to accept what I recommended. And in this case, I developed the three pillars as a framework for moving forward. And he accepted it very readily. And so we could come back to that each time as sort of a framework for thinking about how to move forward, which is very important on the operational institutional side, because there's a lot of competing objectives in conflict resolution and humanitarian affairs, and even human rights, we sometimes bumped heads. So we wanted to have a voice at the table, and that was very important for decision making. And I think we succeeded sometimes, we failed in a lot of cases, but at least we were part of the dialogue. We were not sort of put on the shelf as something that scholars and NGOs talk about, but when the real people at the UN try to make policy, this is nowhere to be seen. I think we made some noise, and sometimes based on success, a few times didn't do as well as he would have liked.
Okay, thanks for that, Ed. And I don't know if anybody of the others want to jump in there, but otherwise I'm going to turn to Jennifer, who of course came in the years after Ed. Your appointment as special advisor was not long after the crisis in Libya, and certainly, you know, some of my strongest memories of working with both you and with Ed were sort of dealing with the aftermath of Libya, and it continues to be, you know, weaponized as a negative example by critics of R2P who associate R2P with regime change. So do you have any reflections on what it was like to serve as special advisor right after that controversy, and any steps you took to kind of help reshape the narrative around R2P at that time?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to see the three other colleagues who have worked so hard on responsibility to protect. What I initially remember, Simon, is so many people saying to me within the UN system, and when I was first appointed, probably partly as a result of Libya, you have one of the hardest jobs in the UN. So that was a reflection, I think, of how people were dealing with that particular episode. I think, for me, the first reflection would be that decision makers, politicians, diplomats are so influenced by particular cases, right? You develop a doctrine that is meant to stretch across a number of circumstances. But we know that, generals fight the last war. And similarly, diplomats are focused on particular cases, and it continues to be so. But of course, situations are so vastly different. And the other thing I tried to stress was just how unusual the Libya case really was. When you think about the number of times that the Security Council has acted collectively to authorize the use of force against a state without its consent for any reason, let alone responsibility to protect, the list is incredibly small. It rarely happens. And in my view, it should rarely happen. You would ideally want a peaceful resolution to a crisis, or you would want a government to provide its consent for the presence of international forces. So it was just so unusual, and we should remember that. But there's no question that it influenced my work a lot. I think, some, myself included, and in the advocacy community, we wanted for several years to say it's not having an impact. We're doing lots of other good work, but the reality is that it was in some ways. And what that meant for us was that we had to really demonstrate the breadth of the agenda that Ed and the Secretary General had laid out. So I focused on a few things in that period. One was, of course, and this was an entree provided by our consultations with member states about what they wanted to see in 2014. And that was an elaboration of Pillar 2. And so we worked very hard on trying to demonstrate what it is that the international community, working in partnership with states, which is, as we should remember, an underlying part of the vision of R2P, and indeed of sovereignty as responsibility, as Francis Dangan outlined it years ago, was working in partnership with states. And what are the various mechanisms you have to do that? And so that was one of the first things we tried to do, was really flesh out the Pillar 2 agenda. The other was a set of two things we did in the office. One was just to work on a compendium of practice. What are states and other actors actually doing to implement their commitments to responsibility to protect across the board, and to try to just show that and collect that in our own way. But of course, you and civil society were doing that as well. And then thirdly was to try to bring out and disseminate the expanded framework of analysis for atrocity crimes, to indicate how we can actually, not to use the word survey, but to look around the world at situations that are at risk, have a set of indicators around the 4 crimes, and begin to develop systems of analysis that allow us to raise particular situations to situations of concern, and to think of policy options around those. So those were tools, those were bodies of knowledge to show the many ways in which R2P was being acted on. But I think lastly, Simon, and you were involved in this as well, was, one of the principles, and I learned this from Ed as well, that I used as a working principle as special advisor, was to never assume that those who were expressing concern about R2P were doing so for self-interested or narrow political reasons, even though in some cases, they might have been. But in the broadest sense, they mostly were not. They were doing so for principled reasons. And so the Brazilian Responsibility While Protecting initiative was a response to try to actively engage with some of the concerns of Libya. And we took some of those ideas, if not with the stamp of Brazil on them, although it provided us with an opening, we took some of those forward and tried in our conversations to address the concerns about the Libya case, which mainly, if we can cut to the chase, I think centered around the accountability of those who use force on behalf of the council, and the responsibility to rebuild. And I think those two ideas we tried to take forward. It was a tough context, but that was what we tried to do.
It's not a real Zoom webinar unless somebody forgets to unmute their mic. So that was just me. That was my turn then. I think we'll all get a turn eventually by the end of today. But thank you for that, Jennifer. And I'm going to come back with some more questions for you. But in keeping with our chronological order, I'm going to now turn to Ivan, who also, I think we all had some technical difficulties this morning, but Ivan had some as well. Ivan, you served as Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights in New York before your tenure as Special Advisor. So I think people would be interested in hearing a little bit about how that experience informed your role as Special Advisor. And just on that, we're trying to publish a series of commentary pieces, which will start coming out probably in the next week or so by each of the special advisors who are on people's screens here. And Ivan has written a really remarkable one about sort of reflecting on some episodes from his period as special advisor, one of which was on visits to Cote d'Ivoire during 2011, and conversations also with leaders in South Sudan during the civil war. So it would be great to hear what role those experiences also kind of played in how you approach the job as special advisor.
Thank you very much, Simon. The paradox was that I was much more involved in operational aspects of atrocity crimes prevention when I was Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights than I was able to do so when I have become mandate holder in charge of responsibility to protect. As Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, I was going to crisis spot where atrocity crimes risks were rising. I was able to be on the ground, to talk to political and military leaders, and to be there at the right time when they did not yet reach the point of no return and when it was possible to influence them. Then I was very frustrated when I have become R2P mandate holder with a mandate to conceptually and politically develop responsibility to protect, but without any financial means or logistics to do the real job of atrocity crimes prevention. And I think this is the future. I think that mandate holders should have an operational role. And there are two ways how we can achieve that. One way would be to change something formally in their mandate, but the alternative is for them to start to interpret their mandate a bit broader.
Thank you for that. No, that's really useful, and I think you've identified a key problem, which I know that you and I think all the special advisors would sympathize with some of the issues that you raised there, and maybe we'll come back to that and discuss a little bit more. Also, Karen, I wanted to bring you into the discussion as well, and this was a question that I think you get asked a lot, and it also comes from an audience member as well. We've got Nicole Yene, an assistant professor at the Pontifical Catholic University in Chile, has asked, since the adoption of the 2005 World Summit outcome document, there's been a lingering kind of question of whether R2P is selectively used by the global north countries to achieve their strategic aims. So do you think there's a north-south divide when it comes to R2P, or is that a false dichotomy? And as the current special advisor, and as somebody who's from the global south, how have you been working to bridge that perception gap?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks for the question. I also just want to add my thanks for the Global Center for organizing this. I mean, it's very useful for me and very interesting also to hear the reflections of my predecessors. So thanks very much again for organizing this. I mean, in terms of this question, you're right. I think it's one that, I think about a lot, that I get a lot. And the first thing I want to say, I want to kind of caution almost, is that, we need to be careful to just assume that there is necessarily a kind of global north position and a global south on R2P. I think these positions are much more nuanced, but having said that, I think it's undeniable that there is a perceived divide. And I also think that this year, the 15th anniversary of R2P, constitutes a really good opportunity for us to revisit and really have a genuine dialogue on this issue. Now, in terms of trying to unravel what is this dichotomy about, I think it partly has to do with addressing the misperception that R2P is a Western concept that's used to advance the interests of the global north. And of course, there's good reason for this, especially in light of centuries of intervention by colonial powers in the global south, and also the kind of late 20th century history of humanitarian intervention, where human rights and other agendas were used really to justify advancing of interests. And of course, ironically, while the responsibility to protect was developed to address these concerns, interventions like the one in Libya, which Jennifer's already spoken about, unfortunately have served to strengthen this perception. And my approach, I think, similar to Jennifer's one, has been that we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what we need to do is we need to learn lessons from Libya, which, as she's also pointed out, are primarily lessons of implementation, and not take a case like Libya as a reason to question the principle itself, or use it as an excuse to do nothing in the people either at risk or currently experiencing atrocity crimes. And I just wanted to add to that, that I think a regrettable outcome of this kind of focus on R2P as really being all about, military force and a hidden agenda is that it really distracts our attention from the fact that R2P it's at its essence, first and foremost, about the prevention of atrocity crimes. And so, it's really only in the extreme situations when member states are either unwilling or unable to protect their populations that collective action is needed. And I know everybody knows this, but I feel like I keep having to emphasize is that, of course, this action can take many forms, including all of the peaceful and the coercive instruments available under the UN Charter, and of course, peacekeeping. And so military action really is a very last resort. I've also tried to address this question by reminding audiences of the origins of R2P, which, I feel as a South African, I feel very proud that of the very deep African roots of R2P in, for example, the OAU's shift from non-intervention to non-indifference, which is also embedded in the AU's charter under Article 4H. Francis Deng, who's been mentioned by Ed as well, his concept of sovereignty as responsibility rather than sovereignty simply as a kind of right. On the other hand, I also want to mention that the fact that R2P continues to be treated primarily as a foreign policy issue by so many states in the global north serves to reinforce the idea that it's somehow a principle that applies only to states in the global south. But if we look around us, we see that the rising discrimination and hate speech against minorities based on, for example, religious or race in many Western states clearly shows us that it's very much an issue of domestic concern. So, if we look back to 2005, all states committed to protecting their populations, which of course include people who are not citizens, from the 4 atrocity crimes and their incitement. What has come to be known as Pillar 1. And so I try to emphasize this to all states, including those in the global north, that if we want to take prevention seriously, all states must accept that prevention starts at home. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Karen. And we've got a whole bunch of questions that have come through from audience members and the Global Center staff who are not on the screen but are behind the scenes here. Jackie and Jahan and Juliet, all the J's, collating questions and sending them through here. So this is for all the special advisors. I guess maybe we'll get 1 or 2 to answer and then we'll move on to another question. But the question says, in divided and fragile societies already suffering from identity-based conflict, the COVID-19 pandemic has increased various risk factors that could lead to mass atrocity crimes. So Blanka Jamnesik, who many of us know, she's the R2P focal point of Slovenia. She asks, how would you see R2P as relevant in this regard, if at all? And what do you foresee as the major impacts of on vulnerable populations by this pandemic? I don't know if there's anybody out there who wants to jump in on that one. Basically, how is COVID-19 increasing the risk factors faced by vulnerable populations in the world? Ivan, over to you.
It's a topic very close to my heart because President of General Assembly appointed a colleague from Afghanistan and myself as coordinators of the UN General Assembly response to COVID-19. So I think about it a lot. We are preparing an omnibus resolution which will, its 0 draft, will be introduced this week, and it will be discussed by member states, where we do address the issue of increased atrocity crimes risk related to COVID-19. COVID-19 has, I think, dual influence. Immediately, it could have the trigger effect. In fragile, already divided societies, it can be an additional factor that can lead to uncontrolled developments that could result in atrocity crimes. But that's not all. It has also an influence on some structural risks, which are related to decrease in economy, to the increase of unemployment. In many developing countries, you will be having the vast amount of young people who do not have money and who do not have jobs and no way to sustain themselves. And it will be relatively easy to mobilize them for various unholy purposes. So we are facing at the moment COVID-19 and are focusing on COVID as a trigger factor, but it's not only a trigger. It will, related to its long-term consequences, having a very negative impact. And if we are not prepared for that, it could have devastating consequences.
So sorry about that. I had a technical problem this time. Jennifer, you had your hand up as well. You wanted to get in on that discussion, and then I'll go to Ed after that. Jennifer? Yeah,
I think Ivan's right that if we look at the different risk factors for atrocity crimes and how it can exacerbate existing ones, that's very clear. And the very increasing of separation between communities, you know, the lack of interaction between communities that we know is so important as a buffer against these dynamics, that instead you're keeping communities apart, but you're also increasing the perceived threat levels, that some communities pose to one another. I think there's two other things here that are important to highlight. One is just what this whole context has thrown up in terms of our knowledge about situations. We are now living in a situation in which we're unable to have the kind of transparency that we had before. So in terms of officials being able to visit country situations, in terms of being able to have engagement, some societies are quite isolated from international engagement. And I think that's really worrying. But the other is, if we look at the big picture, COVID is exacerbating a lot of the geopolitical tensions and the factors that are preventing international cooperation on a range of things, let alone, more robust measures. So I think we can really see COVID providing, heightening dynamics across the board, both on risk factors and on our capacity to respond. But I'm sure Ed will have something more optimistic to say than I have said.
I don't know. Optimism is a precious resource, I think, in the COVID-19 world. But Ed, do you want to add to that at all? You're the first contestant to win the contest on who didn't unmute when they went to talk.
Thank you. I always agree with Yvonne and Jennifer and Karen. We have this sort of relationship, I think. So I would just add a little bit to what they said. One, and it's often forgotten, in fact, when you were reading what the 2005 document said, you left off incitement. And all the heads of state and government agreed to protect populations by preventing the four crimes and their incitement. And I always thought the incitement piece operationally was very important, because you can see or hear incitement and you can do something about it hopefully early on. And I think this is very relevant to the COVID situation, because there is a temptation in many places and among many political leaders to blame certain people from certain parts of the world spreading the virus. And so it provides an excuse for persecution of one sort or another, which could take different forms. Whether it would take forms of one of the four crimes or not, it would be very extreme, but it certainly is quite conceivable. The second piece I think we have to remember is, after atrocity crimes, the number of people who are forcibly displaced. I mean, now it's well over 70 million, the highest since the end of World War II. And most of those people are internally displaced, but a fair chunk, of course, of refugees have got across borders. And there is a real question about what kind of medical care they get and to what extent something like the virus wouldn't spread very rampantly in some of these crowded camps with not the best sanitation and health facilities. So I think we need to think about the number of people who have been affected by atrocity crimes, have had to fled their homes, whole families in these camps. And possibility they, in fact, could become real hotspots. And in fact, in turn, having high rates of infection of the virus. So I think both in terms of incitement and in terms of taking care of those who have been forcibly displaced, I think COVID is a very worrying sign. I think is a big thing on Karen's plate right now. So
thanks for that, Ed. And we've got another question here from an audience member. This is from Grace Anderson from the UN Foundation. She says, how can the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire be seen in the context of R2P? The Global Center put out an atrocity alert last week about this, so there's a cheat sheet out there for you guys, but anybody want to jump in on that one? Karen, do you want to maybe start?
Okay, I've unmuted myself, I think. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I just maybe in terms of your just the last question, you know, something positive as well about the lessons that we can learn from the pandemic. I see so many parallels with R2P as well. I think it's kind of driving home this idea that prevention is better than cure. And this is something which we keep trying to make with regards to the responsibility to protect and atrocity prevention as well. It's obvious that, we need to be preventing atrocities from happening. And I think secondly, it's driven home this idea that, a multilateral solution is one which is absolutely essential, even though we see countries, sadly, I think the reaction we've seen is for states to just, act in self-interest and look inward. But I think in the long run, I think what's become clear is that, we talk about the threats to multilateralism at the moment, but I think this pandemic has really driven home this notion that we're not going to be able to solve this particular transnational challenge as we aren't able to solve many others if we don't approach it in a from a multilateral way. Now, in terms of the ceasefire, I think, again, it really speaks to what some of the others have already said, that of course, atrocity prevention is often very much tied to conflict. So many atrocities, as we know, take place in situations of conflict. Not all of them. I want to make that point as well, because that's something which I think often falls by the wayside when we're thinking about how to prevent atrocities. But in this case, absolutely. The global call for a ceasefire, the whole idea behind that is not just to prevent conflicts, but in the end also to prevent atrocity prevention, or to prevent atrocities. So we have to see these as being absolutely linked. And maybe making a bigger point as well about how atrocity prevention really is very closely tied to other UN agendas. Ed just mentioned the displacement of people, so refugees, and how simply being a refugee makes you much more vulnerable to the risk of atrocities, for example. And the same for conflict. So just from my position, not having cheated off your cheat sheet, so perhaps you should come in on that, Simon, as well. But I think, it's absolutely essential. If we can prevent conflict, we can prevent a lot of atrocities. And if we can get, parties to conflict to respect ceasefires, then we can allow humanitarian assistance to come in. We can allow medical assistance to these vulnerable populations. So absolutely essential if we can get people to recognize that this is an unusual situation that calls for unusual solutions. I'll mute myself again.
And Ivan, you want to jump in on that one too?
Yes, I would just like to add something, and that is that it is really tragic indicator of situation we are in, that the Security Council was not able to pass a resolution supporting and endorsing Secretary General's call. And it is a clear indicator how difficult the situation is and how ineffective Security Council is in preventing conflicts as well as atrocity crimes. And I am very happy that at least we will have this General Assembly resolution where we will be strongly supporting the Secretary General's ceasefire call.
Yeah, I agree with that very strongly. And I mean, it's, you know, sometimes, and I think everybody here will have had this experience where somebody says to you, you know, R2P is a controversial idea, and to which my answer is always that, well, if you're fighting for human rights and the protection of populations, it's always going to be controversial on some level just because of the nature of the world that we live in. But yeah, I wasn't sure that couldn't have predicted that peace would become the most controversial kind of thing to happen at the Security Council in 2020, and that 3 months into a global pandemic, the UN Security Council can't even agree to release a resolution which calls for support for a global ceasefire. Now, I've got this is apparently a collated question, which probably explains why it's about 407 lines long on my iPhone. But I'm just going to try and summarize it here. It's basically about social media and Twitter. So the role of social media and other communication technologies can be used to both uphold R2P and to incite atrocity crimes. Social media bears witness to atrocities, serving as documentation for accountability mechanisms and international action and raising awareness. Yet, as we have seen in several different examples, including Myanmar, Kenya, Sri Lanka, social media can stoke animosity, spread hate speech. We could add the United States into that list, by the way, and incite violence. What steps are needed to prevent hate speech and incitement on social media platforms and to help prevent atrocities? So that's apparently a collation of a number of different questions that came from a bunch of people in different parts of the world. So basically, does anybody want to have a go at the whole question of what responsibility social media platforms play and the kind of dual role that internet technologies can play in both inciting atrocities and, I guess, preventing atrocities as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start off. I think Ed should come in here as well because of his idea about, you know, individual responsibility. I think when we think about this, obviously the 2005 document very firmly places the responsibility to protect in the realm of states, right? So it's state responsibility. And so this then raises questions about, well, what is the responsibility of other actors, including these social media companies, for example? You know, do they even have a responsibility, or do we just say, no, we leave it up to the state? And I like the way in which the question was framed, and that it really, you know, already highlights that social media can be used in both a positive and a negative way. And absolutely, I mean, we see tremendous work being done by, for example, human rights defenders in terms of documenting, atrocities and human rights abuses, which are absolutely essential. And the other important thing is, I think, that we forget about how social media can be used very effectively to spread positive speech as well, and to spread messages of tolerance and resilience. And I think this is something that is really important, and that is highlighted also in the UN strategy and plan for action on addressing hate speech, which of course was launched by the Secretary General last year, and which the Joint Office was actually very, very much part of and led that whole process within the UN system. I think the emphasis there is very much on, as I said earlier, is more speech, not less speech, because we have to be very careful as well, given how we know some governments are likely to interpret these kinds of what they see as challenges or dangers by clamping down on free speech and, you know, claiming that they're doing so in the interest of preventing incitement to violence, for example. So the UN, and I encourage everyone to go and look at that strategy. It's on the OSAPG's website as well, so you can have a look at exactly what it says. But it has a specific definition of what the UN understands by hate speech, particularly hate speech that leads to the incitement of violence, and how we should counter that really by promoting more and positive speech. And I'm talking too much, but yeah, very briefly, I think this is a collective effort. So governments need to be involved, but of course the social media companies are very much part of this, and the UN has also been partnering very closely with companies like Facebook and Twitter to talk about, you know, what they can do to address this problem, both in terms of taking down speech that is dangerous, but also doing the opposite, you know, to promote messages that actually counter these negative messages. I'll stop there for now.
No, thank you, Karen. I'm going to go to Ed, who wants to say something about this, and also to Jennifer. And Ed, maybe in your answer as well, I mean, Karen alluded there to the individual responsibility to protect, which is something that you and your wife, Dana, have both talked about and written about, particularly since you left office as special advisor. Could you maybe say something about your kind of interpretation of that as well? Mute, Ed.
I thought you were going to unmute me, but mixed message there. No, thank you, and thank you to Karen for individual responsibility. Actually, something I did put in the Secretary General's 2009 report on the implementation strategy. And as you say, Simon, it's something that since I left, the UN keeps coming back to me as something that really is fundamental. One of the problems with the 2005 outcome document was that it was a product of states. And of course that was essential, but there's only one passing reference sort of to the international community and civil society, and it's not all developed. There's no reference to the private sector, to business. 2005. There's no reference to non-state armed groups or non-state actors. And one thing I emphasized at that point, and I think it was important politically, but I think it was even more important operationally, was that many of these crimes had been committed and were being committed by non-state armed groups. And it was not only governments. Governments obviously had a prime responsibility, which is emphasized in the first pillar. But if you're going to make a difference, particularly in the second pillar and the third pillar, you needed the involvement of public groups, of NGOs, of women's groups, of the business community, of others. We saw that very much in the very first case we faced in Kenya after the disputed December 2007 elections, where the public response by the business community was very important. And the other thing we found was that very, very often the deciding factor was really the character of the leaders one was dealing with. And were they at all flexible? Or did they deal with these things as some sort of existential struggle of one group against another? And we have a lot of cases in Syria, there's very little room to move, and we have an undeveloped civil society. There's very few partners to work with. But in many other societies, we found governments that were divided, political parties were divided, the public was divided. And so there are people to work with, there are possibility of turning things around. And we found that, in fact, very often these disputes, if related to election violence, actually were easier to resolve than some of those that were undertaken for more existential kinds of reasons. So I think it's very important that we think of the responsibility to protect as a responsibility for everyone and for every group. It's not to sit back and say, oh, the governments haven't done this and the governments haven't done that. And, you know, if we take that kind of attitude, the governments aren't going to be responsive. But if we recognize we have to do something about hate speech, we have to do something about recognizing groups that are being abused one way or another in society. I think that's very much the way that human rights has developed. I think it's very much the way that humanitarian affairs has developed. I think it's very important for R2P. R2P is not just about decisions in the Security Council. It's just not only about criteria for the use of force. It's this comes back to the social media. I'm not sure if you know anything about the social media, but it does seem to me how it's people if they really recognize the priority of human rights and atrocity prevention, they will hear messages in one way. If they are more prone to point the finger and blame one group or another for all the faults in the world, they may listen to other messages. So it's not only the hate speech and it's not only the content, but it's how people receive them. And that is a question of individual responsibility. How do we listen? How do we prioritize it? What do we do if we hear something that we think is wrong? So it's not just the level, it's very much bottom up. You know, people have agency. They're not just sitting there waiting for the UN to act. And they have to use that agency in a positive way, whether they're potential vulnerable groups or whether they're people who see people misbehaving or leaders misbehaving. So I do think it's very important. I think Aaron, I mentioned this fundamental. I think at the same time, it's very important to recognize that many of these crimes are not committed by governments. Many are, unfortunately, but many are committed by non-state armed groups. So thank you.
Thanks for Ed. We've got Jennifer and Ivan who both want to come in on this, and I can see that there's about 24 questions at least that people have submitted. Jennifer, over to you. And I guess Ed's point, your point there, Ed, is we need more upstanders and less bystanders in the world, regardless of where you live in the world, which is a question I actually want to ask the special advisors about in a second. But Jennifer, can we go to you now?
Yeah, I think I enter the conversation on technology with some trepidation, given I'm over 50. But let me try. I think I'd like to begin by saying I think we've done, certainly not enough, but we've done a great deal of thinking about the relationship between technology and incitement and hate speech, and I do think that's an area where we need to continue to be very vigilant. I've been reflecting on other ways in which information has created challenges with respect to R2P. And I think back to an example of something that happened during my time as special advisor was the debate in the Security Council about the referral of the situation in Syria to the ICC. And of course, that referral never moved forward. There was never going to be consensus. But one of the things that was really troubling was just how the information base that in particular the French government was putting forward was questioned in terms of whether it was real. And I think in addition to the use of technology in terms of as a medium, and remember that's all it is, it's just a medium for incitement. Incitement can happen through many ways. We tend to focus on technology. We have to think about the activity that's going on underneath it, right? Both positive and negative. But I think disinformation is, and the questioning of the reliability of information is equally serious. And it's led me to go back to the importance of a system of reliable and credible fact-finding and commissions of inquiry. And one of the commissions that really influenced me a great deal, again, happened during my tenure as special advisor, was the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea that was initiated by the Human Rights Council. And the methodology that was used and the power of that report, I think it was a very successful example of a commission of inquiry. But I think that's what we also really need to rethink in our current environment. How is it that we bring reliable and credible accounts of what is occurring in a world where there is so much competing information and the questioning of the reliability of information? I would just say as well that the whole realm of digital technology also creates challenges for the international community in terms of how it protects populations. Because of course, at times, this obsession that we have to share information can actually endanger communities. And I think UN peace operations have been learning this, that communities sometimes, because of their own strategies that they're using to protect themselves, can actually be undermined by too much information sharing. So this is an entire area that I think really needs more and more thinking by the R2P community in the years ahead. And as a final point, I would agree with both Karen and Ed that the private sector is a hugely important actor in this space. And we need to really broaden our conception of responsibility to include private sector actors.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Ivan, you wanted to say something about this?
I just wanted to add something on what Ed has mentioned, mentioning different groups that are vital for atrocity crimes prevention. I wanted to add religious leaders who can be very powerful force of good or evil. I had practical experiences when in Central African Republic, top religious leaders of Muslim and Christian faith were touring the country together, visiting places which were about to blow with conflicts, ethnic cleansing, atrocity crimes. They were able to calm situation down. And on the other hand, we have seen some religious leaders and devastating consequences in Myanmar. Just recently, we had a meeting here between the UN system and 60 religious leaders and representatives of faith-based organizations with the intention to work together within the context of increased risks of atrocity crimes related to COVID-19. And there is quite a complex program being designed in working together. And I entirely agree with Ed. We should all be very active at the moment.
Thank you for that, Ivan. Just I want to get on to the next question, but very quickly, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to, very quick two-finger. I think it's really important for your listeners to know that the Joint Office has actually been engaged in a number of these three thematic issues. For those of you that follow R2P, you may not think of these particular activities as R2P activities, you know, in inverted commas, but the office has been playing a leadership role on the UN's work with religious leaders, convening that entire effort. And as Karen said, the Joint Office has been the leading agent in the UN's work on thinking about hate speech and countering incitement. So there has been an evolution in the work of the Joint Office as well in terms of how it thinks about agendas that cross the system. So I think it's really important for your listeners to know that and to learn more about them.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Jennifer. I'm going to go on to this other question, which is very close to my own heart. I'm recording this from Brooklyn in the United States, where we've not only had to deal with COVID-19, but also the response to the racial murder by police that people saw during the week. And there was a protest here in my neighborhood yesterday, and we've had a couple of nights of rioting here in Brooklyn as well. So this question comes from Sarah Brooks from the International Service for Human Rights in Geneva. She asks, sovereignty is increasingly used to rebut international scrutiny, quite the opposite of using it as a basis for responsibility. To be more specific, both China and the US are infamous for weaponizing narratives of sovereignty to beat back international action to, respectively, protect ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, the case of the Chinese, of course, or to be held accountable for systemic racism at home and war crimes overseas, the case of the United States. How can civil society seek to recenter the debate on sovereignty as responsibility? What can the UN do better and more creatively to apply the R2P agenda to all states? So who wants to wade into the middle of those waters? Karen, do you want to have a crack at that? Or Ed? Do you want to, maybe we'll go to you, Ed.
Just very briefly, it seems to me that most things at the UN R2P is just one of them. Begin at home. It's a political process, and it's the politics within individual societies that make all the difference. Those then get reflected in the kinds of stances that governments take in the UN, in the Security Council, and other places. And Jennifer earlier talked about the geopolitics. And obviously, and Yvonne made a reference to the Council's futility these days. And it's clear we're living in a time where the geopolitical forces are very unfavorable, and they're feeding into domestic nativism in a way that is very destructive. And R2P is limited in scope and effectiveness because of this. But it's true of many, many other things. The whole international law, multilateral cooperation, international institutions, fundamental norms like human rights, humanitarian affairs. You know, people sometimes say R2P hasn't done very much in Syria, but what norm has really taken hold? Because we're in a period of time, not only where we've had enormous challenges by non-state armed groups to international principle, but we're now having major countries. And I think the US, China, Russia all bear a responsibility here, that they're not standing up for these sorts of norms, and they're getting in the way. And some of this, they relate to domestic politics and by very nationalist agendas that they think are popular for individual leaders. But these have enormously harmful effects. And it takes decades and decades to build these kinds of norms. And it only takes months or a few years to begin to erode them. And putting the pieces back, I think, would be very, very difficult. But I think we have to look first and foremost, not at what's happening in the General Assembly or the Security Council, or even the Human Rights Council, but how are we trying to pressure our own governments to be more active on these issues and be more positive and forthcoming? Because we have a bad political situation, because we've allowed a lot of bad politics to infect our national decision-making. And so I don't care which country you want to point to. This is something around the world that is a very, very serious problem. But, you know, they say politics begins at home. That includes UN politics. So I think that's the first step we have to take.
No, thank you for that, Ed. Yvonne?
In recent years, we have been witnessing a trend of weakening multilateralism as well as human rights. And I think that COVID-19 should serve as a wake-up call. First reactions to COVID-19 were very sovereignistic, closing borders, preventing exports, food, medical supplies, and so on. But this is obviously a dead end. What we need to successfully fight COVID-19 is more and not less solidarity and multilateralism. And without that, we won't be able neither to respond to challenges such as climate change or any other structural threats, including things that we need for atrocity crimes prevention, such as more equality within societies and between different countries. I think that COVID-19 may be hopefully a turning point.
Interesting. I'm going to do a quick lightning round. How about this? Maybe if we could do, if everybody could just share, I mean, I think we'd all have probably agreement on what some of the down points and the most depressing moments over the last 8 or 9 years have been, and whether it be particular things around Syria or around the failure of the UN Security Council to take any kind of action around the genocide in Myanmar. But maybe just very quickly to each of the special advisors, and we'll start with you. We'll go chronologically, I think. Ed, what would you say was one of your most gratifying experiences or a success that you would particularly that you held on to during your time as special advisor? And we'll just go through quickly, and then I'll come back. I've got to try and squeeze in a couple more questions before we wrap up. So, Ed?
Well, I felt good about the conceptual advance and developing the 3 pillars and seeing those stick. I think that was important, sort of laying the framework, and I have never regretted what we said in that first report in 2009 or the way we've gone about it. In terms of operationally, I think it was important to develop a joint office and to work closely with Francis Ding. I think that was necessary and important. The Secretary General pushed that very hard. Third, I'd say that there are individual situations, beginning with Kenya. I hadn't even been officially appointed when the post-election violence occurred in Kenya, but was already working with the Secretary General. And I remember going to the policy committee. It doesn't exist anymore, but that's the Secretary General chairing with the top people around the UN. And no one around the table wanted to refer to this as an R2P situation. And I pushed very hard for it. And I was very pleased that within, I think, 4 days after the election violence, Secretary General came out with a public statement saying that both the opposition leader and the president needed to stop the incitement of many of their people, to recognize they had a fundamental responsibility and that there was accountability potentially. So I felt good about that. And I think there are cases like Kyrgyzstan, Guinea, where the Security Council really didn't take them up. Big powers weren't paying much attention, but the Secretary General was willing to move forward. And I think those were successes. And one place that Yvonne mentioned before, and he had an important role in one part of that, was Cote d'Ivoire. Very tough situation. And people forget it happened really at the same time as Libya. There was a real recognition that atrocities had happened and more could. We had to do something about it. And I think both in terms of the ECOWAS and AU, the UN, there are a lot of actors who came into it. But I think it turned out relatively well.
Yeah, Cote d'Ivoire is the counterpoint to Libya that's not nearly as widely discussed. Jennifer, quickly, major successes or gratifying moments during your tenure?
I think I'll stick to gratifying moments. I find it hard to think about, whether things I've been involved in have been successful or not. For me, I think one of the legacies I lived off of was this desire of both the Secretary General, but also the first special advisor, Ed, to have R2P not be a UN responsibility to protect, but to move out from the UN. And actually, one of my most gratifying experiences as special advisor, and I'm not saying this just because I've worked with Simon, was an event of the R2P focal points in Botswana. And it was an amazing experience for me to hear at a very granular level about what different focal points were trying to do in their societies, and to speak very concretely about how a normative framework and an implementation framework actually gives them guidelines. And I remember coming home from that meeting feeling incredibly invigorated and feeling that that was the kind of work that I needed to be doing more of. I also felt very, very gratified by the discussion we had in the GA around the 2014 report, because I think the discussion showed how the language of states and the engagement of states was beginning to shift. And we had a lot more engagement just in terms of, quantitatively, but it was something that states could really sink their teeth into in terms of how they might work in partnership with states. But those would be my two gratifying periods.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. Yvonne, gratifying moments, successes, greatest hits and memories.
You and Ed mentioned Cote d'Ivoire, so I would like to say something on Cote d'Ivoire. there were some innovative practices aimed at atrocity crimes prevention that were used in Côte d'Ivoire case. First is that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon agreed that we try with something entirely new, and it's sending individualized letters to political and military leaders allegedly involved in some atrocity crimes. They were signed by High Commissioner for Human Rights, saying our information indicates that you were involved in this and that and so on. If this would be the case, you would be responsible under international criminal law. And the result was really tremendous. Literally every person who got those letters was replying, claiming that it was not ordered by them, that it happened the other way around, and that they will do their best to prevent some further crimes to be committed. The other innovative practice is the Secretary General agreed to send me in Côte d'Ivoire during the crisis, which enabled me to, you remember during first period of time, it was pro-Gbagbo forces that were involved in most atrocity crimes commission. But then it was pro-Ouattara forces who were for the first time involved in a massacre at Dwekwe. And being there, I was able to go there to talk to families of victims, to see mutilated bodies. And that enabled me, when I returned in Abidjan, to talk to President-elect Ouattara, who was under UN protection in Gulf Hotel. And the same very evening, Ouattara appeared in front of TV cameras saying that every crime will be punished no matter who are victims and who are perpetrators. And of course, prevention is a non-event, so we do not know to what extent it influenced prevention of atrocity crimes, but I'm sure that it did. So it was very gratifying.
Thank you for that, Ivan. Karen, you're just new, reasonably new, so you haven't had the kind of opportunity to get as many successes or gratifying moments under your belt. But how do you feel?
Yeah, I think my response to that would be that, similar to what others have said, there's often this kind of question about, well, what have been the successes of R2P, because we tend to focus on the failures, and maybe picking up on the very last point that Ivan made, that prevention is kind of a non-event. I think for people, looking in from the outside, if we see the UN being kind of the inside, perhaps, it seems that there tend to be a lot of, frustrations and failures with things like Security Council deadlocks. But I think for me, what's been gratifying since taking up this position has been really to recognize the hard work that's going on all the time by people in the UN system. I'm thinking of people in my office. Ed at the beginning talked about the importance of being at the table. So, people who are putting the issue of atrocity prevention, putting it as a priority in discussions at the UN, whether it's about country situations, where it's about thematic situations. So that work is continuing. And when we've seen deadlocks in the Security Council, we've seen the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council stepping up and, taking actions and taking initiatives to the extent that they can. And I also think of, civil society and the role that they've played. I mean, the Global Center as a kind of global organization promoting R2P, but also, earlier there was talk about, well, what do you do in terms of keeping the state accountable, in terms of its responsibility as a sovereign state. And here I think of a civil society organization like Protection Approaches in the UK. So civil society, I think, is continuing to do tremendous work. And then I also wanted to mention regional organizations. So again, we talk about the failures and the threats to multilateralism. I think multilateralism at the regional level is alive and well from how I see it. So I think we're seeing a lot of work being done there that often also goes unmissed. And again, as Ivan said, you know, prevention doesn't make headlines. And so all the work that's being done by individual states to build, you know, resilient societies, whether that is through empowering women, which of course is the focus of this year's report, that's a really important kind of preventive tool, because we know that where societies are, where there are high levels of discrimination and violence against women, there's also a higher risk of atrocities. So all of this work that largely goes unnoticed, I think that for me has been gratifying.
Thank you for that, Karen. No, and that great comments there. I have never been special advisor for R2P, but I'd say from my own perspective, working with you guys has obviously been a great journey, and as a civil society person. And I think for me, you know, it's interesting hearing you guys talk about that, because being sort of on the fringes of all of those kinds of events over the last 8 or 9 years. But, you know, I think for me, one of the biggest successes of the last couple of years is, even in the midst of failure around the international community's failure to take action around the genocide in Myanmar, was seeing a tiny state like the Gambia in West Africa, working with ourselves and other civil society partners like the Global Justice Center, and actually taking that case to the International Court of Justice and holding people accountable. And I really hope that is going to have, it's not going to fix everything in the world, but hopefully it'll have a deterrent effect on other perpetrators. And we had a question from somebody in Estonia about that case, but I'm very conscious of the time. So sorry, Nicole, we're not going to be able to get to your specific question about the ICJ case, but maybe just in the couple of minutes that we have remaining, because we really do need to end at 10:30, maybe if I could just say to our special advisors, and we'll do a round to see if who all can jump in, or if you don't want to jump in on this one, it's up to you. But this is a question which comes from Lucas de Belmont in Brazil. And I think it's a good question to end today's conversation, which is, as we are celebrating the 15th anniversary of R2P this year, what do you see as the future of R2P, especially given the rise of nationalism, isolationism, climate change, social media, etc. Or in other words, I guess to paraphrase Lenin, that's Vladimir Ilyich, not John, what is to be done with R2P as we take it into its next decade. So who wants to go first on that one? Or should we go in chronological order of special advisors again? Ed, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. When you go chronological order, guarantees someone else gets the last word, which is a good thing. I point to the historical analogy of the UN itself. It went through the Cold War. It went through the unipolar moment. It went through a very messy form of multipolarity that never quite came together. It's gone through one financial crisis after another. It's had a lot of leaders who have, from the outside, who have questioned its relevance, but it persists. And I think a valuable idea like R2P is sustainable. And I'm encouraged that despite all the negative currents these days, it's still moving forward. And I think it's a couple of things. One, the job of curbing mass atrocities, preventing mass atrocities, was never going to be simple or quick. There are no magic formulas, and R2P didn't provide one. And that work has to keep going on and on and on. And it's sometimes against pretty big headwinds, but it's worth doing it. And so what I'm most encouraged about is the work. The work continues. And as long as the work continues, there will be some positive results. There will be young people who see this and recognize the valuable potential that R2P has. And so I think we have to stop wringing our hands and worrying about the fact that it hasn't changed everything in the world. Human rights hasn't changed everything in the world. Humanitarian principles haven't changed everything in the world, but that doesn't make them any less valuable. In fact, sometimes they're more valuable when the going gets tough. And so, you know, there's an old phrase, I guess, from the Marine Corps, which probably shouldn't be used here. But when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And so we need the advocates of R2P to be tough and to recognize that so few headwinds is no reason to turn around. So thanks very much. And I would say, Simon, when you talk about individuals making a difference in IR2P, since you've come aboard, and I remember when you came aboard, the Global Center, it's really made a big, big difference. And I think this work with the Gambia on the ICJ is really a stunning example of that. So congratulations.
You're going to make me cry, Ed, if you're not careful. Monday morning isn't crying time. Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks. It's a big question. I guess I'll make 3 points. One is, I think in the very immediate term, we move forward by just reiterating that sovereignty is not the problem, right? I think in framing R2P as a challenge to sovereignty, some have taken us down the wrong path. Sovereignty is the building block, and we are in a moment of resurgent sovereignty. But that doesn't mean that R2P loses its relevance. It's deeply connected with the idea of sovereignty. So it is about creating capable states that can also provide for the rights of their citizens. And I think that that's an important piece to move forward from. And linked to that, it's about finding common ground among sovereign states at the multilateral level. And as Ed says, that at many points in history has been so difficult. I mean, think about what democracy is internally. It is also about finding common ground. And this is what we have to do right now. We have to find common ground where we can find it. And my mantra in this has always been find that common ground on the basis of what states have already agreed to, and relentlessly remind them of what they have already agreed to. You know, one of the steps we made in my time as a special advisor was to just emphasize a little bit more the notion that R2P relates to crimes, international crimes, which every state in the world has agreed are matters not of purely domestic concern, but international concern, and that we work forward on the basis of that recognition. And your work with the Gambia, but also the work of countless others to really continue to hammer that home, that while we live in a world of sovereign states, there are certain things upon which we have agreed, and we have to find common ground about how to implement them. And lastly, picking up on something mentioned earlier, but I think it's more important than ever, and I remember stressing this in my final months as special advisor with the EU, is that R2P is not a foreign policy issue for many states. It's an issue for all states. And we're moving into a moment where I think that reality needs to be taken, much more seriously, and may enable some interesting coalitions across states and with civil society in the coming years. But I just want to salute everyone who continues to push forward this principle in the different ways that they find possible in this currently seemingly dark context.
Thank you, Jennifer. Ivan, we'll go to you. Quick final comments on what needs to be done.
Well, I mentioned already that last couple of years, multilateralism has been weakening and human rights were backsliding. And COVID-19 made things even worse at the moment. However, I sincerely believe that it may be a turning point and that trends will be changing. To be very brief, I would say that future of R2P is operationalization or marginalization. It cannot stay as is.
Thank you for that, Ivan. Karen?
Yeah, I think, well, as Ed started off saying, you know, counting the benefits of being first, I think I'm now at the end. So I think all the important things have been said, and I just want to kind of reaffirm what everyone has said, and I agree with all of them. So I think perhaps all I can add is just also that, you know, we need to, as I think Jennifer said as well, we need to emphasize the fact that R2P really starts with the responsibility of the sovereign state, right? So it's really not a threat to sovereignty, shouldn't be seen as such. Having said that though, that means that states have to then comply, and they have to fulfill their responsibilities towards their populations, and that, you know, there has to then be a cost, whether political, economic, or otherwise, for states who don't comply with those responsibilities. And I think again there, you know, other states play an important role, civil society plays an important role. And the other thing I think that has also been said is, you know, we need to continue this dialogue to be able to find a consensus or a compromise between states. And here I really think we need to be hearing more voices from the global south. So, you know, having been in this discussion now for just over a year, I tend to hear a lot of voices from the global north. And so I really want to encourage, especially those people listening who are from the global south, to become part of this conversation, you know, whether it's in your own institution, whether you're a student at a university, whether it's as part of a national civil society organization, to also ask questions about what is your state doing in terms of living up to the commitments that it made in 2005 in terms of protecting its own population. So that is really what I would encourage everyone to do. And then maybe just end off by saying that, you know, increasingly I've come to realize that, sorry, preventing atrocities is really at the heart of what the UN was set up to do 75 years ago. And I think we need to remind ourselves and the member states of that. And that is also, I think, the standard by which the work of the UN is often judged. It's about what has the UN been able to do to save the lives of people in, whether it's Syria or Myanmar or elsewhere. And, you know, so just finally, I think reminding ourselves that the promise of never again remains as relevant today as ever. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Karen. And again, I'm getting a signal that we really have to end up. So our time is up. Thank you to our special advisors. We had a lot of questions that we didn't get to answer, including from Estonia, the UK, Cameroon, China, Sweden, Myanmar, Canada. So I'll try and, if those people are interested, I might try and send them a personal response, particularly those who are in situations where atrocities are actually happening. So thanks everybody all our panelists, thanks to everybody who submitted questions ahead of time or who joined the discussion, especially, as I said, to our 4 special advisors. During the coming weeks, we'll be publishing reflection pieces written by each of the special advisors to commemorate the 15th anniversary of R2P. So look for those on our social media and on our website. And again, thank you to everybody, and have a good day, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon.
Simon.